Let's begin then. So the second session of the day. In this session, we're looking at Transregional and Southeast Asian themes. And to begin with, it is my pleasure to present Dr. Darini Rajasingham-Senanayake, who is a social and medical anthropologist from the International Centre for Ethnic Studies in Sri Lanka. And she's going to present a presentation entitled Zone of Peace, the Environmental Impacts of the Militarization of the Indian Ocean Region. Darini, when you're ready. Thank you very much. For our next presenter, I'm very pleased to present Professor Greg Brenkov, who is an environmental historian at the University of Hull and at the Ateneo de Manila University. And he is going to present a paper entitled Unsafe Harbours, the Impact of Typhoons on Local Shipping in the Late 19th Century Philippines.
Thank you, Philip. My paper, as you said, is on the impact of typhoons on local shipping in the late 19th century. It's very much ongoing work, and I haven't even actually gone through all the documents yet. I was lucky a couple of years ago to find a series of documents in the Archivo Nacional in Madrid detailing all the reports on natural hazards that had occurred on the island of Luzon between May and October 1881. Some clerk or series of clerks had had the unfortunate job of cutting out every newspaper clipping in the papers, collecting all the documents from observatories and government officials, etc., and collating them into a series of documents. I have no idea what the purpose behind doing that was. Now, 1881 is not an exceptional year in any event. It's, in fact, a year sandwiched between the Manila earthquake of 1880 and the 20th of October 1882 typhoon that was widely publicized by Father Federico Faura. And so it's what I call actually a singularly uneventful year. So 1881 might not be an exceptional year in the Philippines, but when you start reading the documents, what you get is a detailed account of the amount of damages wrought and lives lost. That is a consistent tally, daily tally, that actually might be much more important in shaping everyday lives, past and present, than the big events. And I'm harking on my old tune of thinking about hazard more as a frequent life event. And in the course of this wider research, I've been struck by the continuous references to loss of smaller vessels, both just offshore or in ports that are really not normally acknowledged in historical accounts. Around the South China Sea in the second half of the 19th century, we get a series of observatories established to monitor the particular effects of typhoons, and there's a list of them there, the main ones, beginning with the founding of the Manila Observatory in 1865. Traders, ship owners, and insurance companies were often the chief proponents behind the establishment of these observatories, as much as, or in some cases, rather than government and colonial navies. For instance, the Manila Observatory, the first in the region, was established and equipped by such interests in which Western merchants like the Dutch consul and trader Georg van Pollan and Petel, and international trading companies such as Smith, Bell and Company, Peel, Hubble and Company, etc., figure prominently. Why was there such an interest in typhoons in the 19th century? Well, the Philippine Sea, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea, the Bohai Sea, and the Sea of Japan were alive with Western marine and maritime activity. In fact, a lot of ships were sunk. Some typhoons were even called after the unhappy vessels that sank in these events, as in the case of the Bocana typhoon of 1892, named after an English steamer that sunk off the southern tip of Formosa, Taiwan, with a loss of 125 lives on the 10th of October. As people have already said, both Marco and Jim the other day, there are about 20 typhoons that regularly enter the Philippine area of responsibility, about 25% of the world's total. 95% of these typhoons originate in the Pacific, but only about 45% that enter the Philippine area of responsibility actually hit the islands. Typhoons can occur in any month of the year, but they're more frequent between July and November. And research data seem to suggest, in fact, that that typhoon season is gradually shifting later in the year, as there are now more cyclones in December. Turning specifically to the typhoons between May and October 1881, we have details of 10 typhoons between May and August, 3 of which hit Luzon on the 23rd of May, the 28th of June, and then the worst one on the 19th of August, and 2 more strong typhoons in October as well. Perhaps it's estimated by the local officials that as many as 19 typhoons are recorded in a 6-month period. Some idea of the magnitude of these typhoons can be given by the report of the terrible typhoon that hit the the Gulf of Manila Bay on the 19th of August, and that destroyed the newly constructed iron lighthouse of San Nicolas. This lighthouse had only been inaugurated in 1879. It's located on was located on an islet 7 miles offshore in Manila Bay. And all that was left at the end of the storm were the great screw piles to which the tower had been attached. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any picture of this. So the official reports conclude at the end of this report, this series of documents, that Luzon, quote, as almost always, has suffered most and has been left in a truly disastrous situation, and that the last few months have been a hard and sad memory. Well, this history of typhoons, therefore, the one I've been describing, has predominantly been one of foreign merchants and companies, of European and North American shipping, and Western science and technology. The focus on the oceans and the seaways, on the large ships and the foreign, obscures the importance of coastal and inshore waters and the smaller vessels that plied them and the local situations. Local waters were served by a huge and diverse variety of crafts, from the foreign-made steamships to locally built traditional vessels, including some uniquely designed for local conditions, such as the casco, a flat-bottomed, square-ended barge used on rivers or as a lighter to transport goods to and from moored ships. Most of these vessels were built entirely from native timbers, and I've put a list of them there. You can see some of these species of wood had special properties that were useful for shipbuilding, either in terms of strength, resistance against shipworm. They were straight, or they were flexible, or they didn't splinter, one or the other. They were crewed by local sailors. They were owned by individual residents. We have the names of some of them in the reports. Senor Aramburu and the Munoz brothers owned respectively the brig schooners Leonor and Navarra that were lost, or part of a fleet locally owned by a Spanish named company, such as the steamship Maraviles that was owned by Reyes and Company. They carried cargoes and passengers from port to port, around lakes, across bays, down rivers, or to and from vessels that were moored in the harbor. And the socioeconomic significance of this maritime activity has not really been paid, I think, sufficient attention, nor is the frequency and devastation caused by typhoons and storms being factored properly into the historical account. If we look at some of the array of vessels that I'm talking about here, there's lots of overlap between these categories. We have more inter-island vessels, such as barks and traditional sailing schooners and brigs, and even steamships, down to the coastal, lighter other forms of sailing boats, some of them unique to the Philippines. And then the local boats, the casco that I've already described, a lot of these were flat-bottomed, small trading crafts. And then we have finally the traditional types of vessels, the banca, the barangay. These are outriggers these were used for both transport and for fishing, or the larger vessels, the paraos. What did these vessels carry? Well, they seem to have carried four kinds of cargoes. The cargoes are sometimes mentioned in the accounts of the losses of the vessels. There are bulk commodities, both for the internal market and for export, as water was really the only economic means of transportation within and between islands at the time. The first railway from Manila to Dagupan in the north only opened in 1892, and land transport was slow, uncomfortable, and costly. Naturally enough, given the date, timber figures predominantly or prominently in these cargoes, especially to Manila, presumably for the reconstruction that was going on after the 1880 earthquake. In fact, we know that the 1863 earthquake of Manila had actually kick-started the timber commerce in the islands. We also see a local trade, more in essentials like corn or sugar being brought to Manila, some of this for undoubtedly for domestic use, other for export. There's also an inter-island commerce, and cloth figures prominently in this. It's often described as part of a Chinese commerce, often again using traditional vessels, and it can be of a considerable scale. The cargo lost on the 25th of October, for instance, was valued at 20,000 pesos, which is a very substantial sum for the time. And clearly even saltwater damaged cloth was worth salvaging from wrecks and had some resale value. Another cargo was specie or coin. It's not really described the purpose for carrying this, but we can imagine that this is really for paying government salaries or for local commerce. For instance, 3 money chests containing, again, a substantial amount of 12,000 pesos was retrieved after the loss of the steamship Maraviles during a typhoon in June in Albay. And the final other major cargo was people, passengers. It's evidently these kinds of crafts were the main way people and their families and children traveled around both between islands and within islands, utilizing all kinds of craft, including barges, the cascos, paraos, as well as sailing ships and even steamships. People may have been even the main cargo in some cases. So we have an example of the casco number 140 that was sunk off Bankusa en route from Bataan, in which 7 men, 8 women, and 2 children were rescued on the 26th of May. And that must surely have been almost the entire ability of the craft to carry. Routes, a lot of routes, of course, led to Manila. We know that around the bay and the area around there, that on the 29th of October, the typhoon interrupted the regular steamship services across Manila Bay to and from Cavite, Bulacan, and Pampanga for several days. As I said, a lot of routes were actually supplying Manila with what it needed in terms of commodities, but there were also clearly inter-provincial routes too. So the route from Tabaco, where Marco is living, to Legazpi was, for instance, serviced by a regular steamship service. So what about the loss of these vessels? Now, I haven't even gone through all the documentary evidence I have at the moment, but I have as many as 30 or more references to maritime incidences, mainly involving multiple vessels involved. So the scale of this carnage, I call it at sea, was enormous and unrelenting, and involved vessels from the largest and the most modern to the smallest and most traditional. And as I said, this is just my first take at trying to organize and think about the raw data here. But to give you some examples, The so-called Albay typhoon that hit Albay and Sorsogon on the 27th of June resulted in the loss of the steamship Maraviles, 4 brig schooners, the Navarro, Leonor, Carmelita, and San Rafael, 3 other unspecified sailing ships, the Legazpi, the San Fernando, and La Joven Patrona. All the descriptions we have is that their hulls were shattered. Along the beach from Las Piñas and to Pacor in Cavite between the 19th and the 20th of July, a very short distance, really. I wouldn't imagine it more than about 20 kilometers at the most. We have a report of 4 loches, that's flat-bottom boats, 1 barge, 1 brig, 1 schooner, 1 pontine, that's a small trading boat, and 1 larger vessel with 3 masts, probably the Masonic, that was sunk at one time. Local cascos, you can see the cascos here. This is this flat-bottom barge, seem to be particularly vulnerable, perhaps because of their flat bottom during typhoons, though the scale of loss describing these may simply be due to the ubiquity of the vessel. It seems to be one of the most common vessels used. And again, many of the reports are too unspecific to actually say that the quantity of the vessels were lost. So for instance, in Manila Bay on the 25th of May, we're told that several cascos were sunk in Manila Bay. But larger and more modern vessels were also damaged or sunk. The steamship Biñan ran aground off Punta Jalajala in Laguna de Bay with broken chains, a lost chimney, and taking on water on the 28th of July. The steamship Reina Mercedes became entangled during a typhoon in August with an English vessel, and only the quick action of both captains saved both from sinking. But some were not so lucky, and we have a report from Albay in July of the loss of the steamship Aeolus in again, the port of Tabaco. Many brigs, schooners, and other smaller sailing ships suffered a similar fate to that of the schooner San Pedro that was smashed on the rocks on the 19th of August. Traditional vessels such as paraos may have fared better because perhaps with their construction with 2 outriggers may have gave them more stability. They're certainly not mentioned as commonly as other vessels. One of the rare exceptions where they are was the suspected loss of parao of the Catanduanes Islands, carrying amongst other passengers a Padre Clemente Emerciano, but this is a fairly rare exception. But of course, it's also apparent that the loss of many small vessels is largely or is underreported or unreported. So occasionally we get references to, for instance, in the town of Enrile in Cagayan, we get a quote that nearly all local craft were sunk on the 25th of October. Or a large number of vessels were lost carrying valuable merchandise. These are, of course, impossible to quantify any further. A rare exception of smaller sailing vessels is that of the fishing bunker that was lost in Laguna de Bay on the 23rd of August. 1 dead and 2 survived.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you wrap up in about 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Yes. Apologies. I sent you a note.
Sorry. Okay. Well, I will skip over then the experience of seamen. We don't have an awful lot to go on this. There's little in the way of personal experience, but we do have some accounts that show what it was actually like for seamen to actually experience and be shipwrecked. So I'll move on to my conclusion then. Nor was the carnage in 1881 that I've been described in any way untowards or exceptional. Padre Federico Fara, in his account of the 20th of October, 1882, published in La Oceania Española, lists the name of 57 vessels, including steamships, frigates, sailing ships, schooners, lighters, and the like, that were damaged or bad or lost in the Manila Bay and the Pasig River in that one typhoon. Nor are these reports confined to just the Philippines. A newspaper report of the 31st of October, 1881 in El Comercio reported how the great typhoon in September of Tamsui River in Taiwan destroyed a great number of sampangs and led to the death of some 800 Chinese, mainly Chinese crew. So what does this sort of narrative that I'm talking about, this history, tell us particularly about the past? Well, first of all, I think it's about a reclaiming an indigenous and local history of the sea that has been largely obscured by historians' preoccupation with the main narratives of maritime history, what I call big ship history, and the history of Western science. Secondly, it gives us some idea of both the importance of local shipping and the huge impact that such a continual maritime carnage might have had on local and economic and colonial economies. Thirdly, nearly all these vessels were made of wood, and their continual repair and replacement, you can see in the picture here, people actually repairing a casco, meant that the replacement is really a hitherto unassessed impact, had an unassessed impact on native forests and particularly certain species of tree. And we could talk about genetic erosion going on here. And finally, the stories that I've been talking about are an important part of the maritime tradition of both the Philippines and of the history of the wider Indian Ocean world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Greg. All right, our final presentation of this panel is by Dr. Archisman Chaudhuri, who, like me, is a postdoctoral fellow at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill. There's been a slight change to the schedule here, or to the attention here. The title is, in fact, the title of Archisman's presentation is, in fact, Eruptions of Mount Bromo in Java and the Long 19th Century. So, Archisman, when you're ready.
Great, thank you very much. Greetings to everyone across the globe. I hope you and your families are doing well. Today, I'm going to speak on eruptions of Mount Bromo, which is an active volcano in Java, Indonesia, during the 19th century. So let's get started with the basics. Where is Mount Bromo? Mount Bromo is located in the Tengger Mountains in eastern Java in Indonesia. It's located in a 16-kilometer wide Tengger caldera. For those who are uninitiated, caldera basically means a large crater. And this volcanic complex goes back to more than 800,000 years. This is sort of a rough idea of Bromo's location in eastern Java. Well, I took this picture from the website of the Global Volcanism Program, Smithsonian Institution, which shows us the Bromo Tengger caldera in eastern Java. Now, why did I choose to look at Mount Bromo? Before I get onto that, I should just perhaps explain how I am going to approach this study. Basically, I follow my ideas for this PowerPoint presentation from a paper published on the 2010 eruptions of Mount Bromo in the journal Natural Hazards and Earth System Sciences, which calls this volcano as part of a human volcano system that not only exposes the surrounding communities to environmental catastrophes, but also offers benefits. So why do I study Bromo? It's the youngest and the only active volcano of the Tengger caldera in eastern Java. And it has been relatively understudied, while of course there are more well-known accounts of volcanic eruptions in Java during the 19th century, like the eruptions of Tambora, Krakatau, and Merapi, over which Gamal spoke earlier today. Bromo, despite its long eruptive history over the 19th and 20th century, which totals to as many as 60 eruptions, is relatively understudied. More importantly, from the perspective of the planet's environmental history, the eruptions of Bromo stretch over from the Little Ice Age to the warmer period in the second half of the 19th century. So how do I go about studying the eruptions of Bromo? Primarily, my research, unfortunately, has been restricted to reading digitally available primary sources, which are available through the website of the National Library in the Netherlands and a few other journals. For instance, Verhandelingen van het Batavia's Genootschap de Kunst en Wetenschappen. Basically, this translates to Transactions of the Batavian Society for Arts and Sciences. Natuurkundig Tijdschrift voor Nederlands-Indie, which roughly translates to Journal of Physical Studies in the Netherlands Indies, and Franz Junghuhn's accounts of Java. All of these sources were produced in the 19th century, and 19th century Dutch colonial science sort of moved in different waves. Dutch colonial research, or scientific research to be more precise, on Indonesia moved in different waves from the 17th century onto the 18th century and then into the 19th century. Majority of these works were produced from the first half of the 19th century. Probably the most extensive is Franz Wilhelm's accounts of Java, which was the result of his many excursions around the mountains, the volcanic mountains of Java. So what happens with Bromo in the 19th century? As many as 27 confirmed eruptions of the mountain are recorded during the 19th century. And all of these have an eruptive scale of 2, which is not really so dangerous, probably on an eruptive scale of volcanoes. And to understand what kind of impact the eruptions of Bromo could have on human-environment interactions, I will briefly discuss 3 different case studies. So my first case study is from the eruption that occurred in November 1829. The mountain was seen to emit heavy smoke from the 5th of November, which increased over the next few days, created primarily in the southwestern directions of the mountain, ash dust, which damaged trees, but more importantly, it damaged crops in the Tengger and Malang mountains of the surrounding area. And it also led to contamination of river water. The next case study that I look at is from January 1842. Although there is a gap of sort of 14 years between the first case study and the second case study, what we should remember is the mountain, volcanic mountain of Bromo, remained active throughout the 1830s, except for a brief period for 4 years in the late 1830s and early 1840s. Heavy eruptions were reported from Mount Bromo in January 1842, with explosions being heard far and wide. The smoke continued for the next 8 days. More interestingly, this case study, as Franz Junghuhn tells us, after this eruption, or sort of immediately during and after this eruption of Mount Bromo, epidemic fevers broke out in the northern part of the Tengger Mountains, which were caused by the smoke from the volcano. These fevers affected many people, but they also sort of depleted the labor available in the which worked in the sugar industry in Bayaman. Bromo continues to be active over the next couple of decades for a 30-year period between 1850 and 1880. Although there were not any major damages reported from the eruptions. More importantly, if we look at Franz Junghuhn's accounts of Bromo, the vegetation around the mountain is also not destroyed or its growth arrested by these eruptions. The next set of heavy eruptions occurred from November 1885, and with few pauses continued until April 1886. These eruptions primarily emitted heavy ash and smoke in the atmosphere. They damaged crops around the Tengger Mountains, and eruptions continued from Bromo in the 1890s, although the Dutch colonial accounts, which I read, do not report any major damages. So what is the broader context for studying Bromo? Bromo, as I pointed out, is a human volcano system. Its history of settlement is traced back to the fall of the Majapahit kingdom in Java in the late 15th century, and Franz Junghuhn, on the basis of his study of the volcanic craters, argues that there was continued settlement in the region from the late 15th century. And we get some ideas of what sort of livelihood the mountainous communities around the mountainside of Bromo had. Primarily, agriculture comprised growing onions, castor beans, and maize. They also depended on a bit of littoral trade. If you remember the map, which I showed in the second slide, Bromo is quite close to the sea and also to other trading networks in the region. And it's a sacred mountain. So it used to observe an annual feast every year with offerings to the crater. In this case, I think we might as well recall yesterday's presentation on the volcanic eruptions of Bali, which also spoke of a similar account of how volcanic mountains are perceived by the inhabitants. I'm briefly going to turn to the sort of the so what question of these eruptions. Bromo, even during the 19th century, it continued to be thronged by Europeans as a major tourist attraction. It was quite popular in 19th century Dutch travelogues. For example, I'm just going to use two here. Steven Adrian Badding's Nederlands Oost-Indie and Willem Theodor Schevers Deenot Herinneringen ene reis naar Nederlands-Indie, and many others. They kept on referring to Bromo because it sort of falls on the touristic networks in Eastern Java. So finally, I'm going to try and provoke a few questions which, due to the paucity of the sources that I consulted, I cannot explore. What does the eruption of Bromo, such a long history, tell us about the human-environment relationship in the context of the 19th century? Especially, volcanic eruptions have been known to cause a lot of cloud cover in the environment, which often obstruct solar radiation, as it happened with the eruptions of Tambora in 1815, which led to, as environmental historians have termed it, a year without summer in Europe in 1816. So if we were to look at these continual eruptions of Bromo during the 19th and 20th century, a very interesting question to explore would be what were the long-term effects of the eruptions of Bromo on temperature, weather, and climate in Eastern Java. More importantly, what does it tell us about how communities perceive climate? I'm just going to make a very open-ended argument here. I think the eruptions of Bromo, which I have studied, makes us rethink the notion of environmental disasters. While there could be volcanic eruptions, there are reports that the mountain and its surrounding region is restored with its soil fertility within 3 years after each eruption. And the volcanic rich soil is also credited as a major cause of fertility in the 19th century accounts, which I have discussed. Also, I think another angle to investigate would be the expansion of Dutch colonial state in the 19th century, especially the sugar industry around Bromo, whose operations, as we have noted, could be impacted by its eruptions. I think that was more or less. I'm almost within 15 minutes. I think I will stop here, and thank you very much. Special word of thanks to Professor Campbell, who sort of encouraged me to move beyond my expertise of the VOC archives and look at more of 19th century human environment interaction in Southeast Asia. I hope this little adventure on Bromo doesn't turn out to be completely futile. Thank you.